really good to talk to you. Director of 20 Days in Mariupol, thank you.
Thank you.
Do stay with us here on BBC News.
Live from London, this is BBC News. At least 27 people are killed as two explosions hit Pakistan's Baluchistan province on the eve of the general election. We'll be live with our correspondent in Islamabad for the very latest. The crisis in dentistry in England as people queue for the NHS appointments, and the government sets out a new plan.
I've extracted 13 of my own teeth.
The US Secretary of State meets with Benjamin Netanyahu, the latest push for a ceasefire and hostage deal.
On Verify today, we've been looking at the government's claims that poor weather conditions had no impact on a fall in small boat crossings in the Channel.
And let sleeping bears lie. We look at some of the beautiful images from the Wildlife Photographer of the Year competition and talk to the organisers. Hello and welcome to Verified Live. We start in Pakistan. Two bomb explosions have gone off in the southwest of that country just hours before polls open for the general election tomorrow. Let me just take you through the images we have so far and the information. At least 27 people have been killed and many more injured. Authorities say they were targeting the election offices in two parts of Baluchistan. The people of Pakistan will head to the polls after a campaign marred by violence and claims of poll rigging. Well, these are some of the pictures in so far. These from the blast in the Pishin district outside the election office of the independent local candidate. Officials told the BBC he was meeting his polling agent at the time. Around the world and across the UK, you're watching BBC News. Now, let's turn to a story developing here in the UK over the last couple of hours, because Rishi Sunak is facing calls to apologise for a jibe about Sir Keir Starmer's position on trans people at Prime Minister's questions, just moments after the Labour leader told MPs that the mother of the murdered teenager Brianna Ghey, who was transgender, would be watching PMQs from the public gallery. Have a listen to the exchange. You're live with BBC News. Now, campaigners in England say dental care in the country is in crisis, with millions unable to get help on the National Health Service. But the government is announcing new plans to improve access, those plans including offering top-up payments for dentists to take on new NHS patients, as well as bonuses to work in underserved areas. But health leaders, they say the measures simply do not go far enough. Here's our health editor, Hugh Pym. As I say, that hasn't been triggered yet. Catherine Peppenster, thanks so much. Catherine, mentioning Prince Harry there, we understand that he is now back at Heathrow Airport. We saw him fly in yesterday. He is now about to fly back out to Los Angeles. Plenty more on the live page. Head there, much more information. You're watching BBC News. Welcome to BBC News. Let's turn to our main headlines here. At least 27 people are killed as two explosions hit Pakistan's Baluchistan province on the eve of the general election. Israel continues its offensive in Gaza as negotiations on a ceasefire continue. We'll talk live to a spokesman from the World Food Programme who's just returned. Ukraine has come under drone and missile attacks from Russia as the EU's chief diplomat visits Kyiv. We have a special BBC report with the teams trying to tackle America's growing synthetic opioid crisis. And we'll look at some of the beautiful images from the Wildlife Photographer of the Year competition and talk to the organisers. Well, all of that is coming up. First, though, let's head to the BBC Sports Centre, round up the sport of the day. Chetan is there, and good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Matthew. Thank you. We're going to start at AFCON. The 34th edition of the Africa Cup of Nations has reached the semi-final stage with both matches on Wednesday. The hosts Ivory Coast play the Democratic Republic of Congo, but there's more Super Bowl build-up on the BBC Sport website. We'll have more for you later, but that, Matthew, is all your sport for now.
Chetan, thanks so much. Thanks a lot. Now, let's go back to the Middle East, the situation in Gaza, because we've been touching upon the ceasefire talks that are ongoing while the humanitarian crisis just worsens. According to the Hamas-run health ministry, more than 27,500 people have been killed in Gaza since the attacks on Israel on October the 7th. And with little aid getting in, the population faces severe shortages of food and healthcare. The World Food Programme says that more than 500,000 people, that's a quarter of Gaza's population, are facing a high risk of starvation and death. Sarah Rainsford with that, the latest from Kyiv, around the world and across the UK. You're watching BBC News.
BBC News, bringing you different stories from across the UK. For more stories from across the UK, head to the BBC News website.
You're live with BBC News. Now, we have a visual treat for you for the next few minutes because the winning images in this year's Wildlife Photographer of the Year competition have been made public. This stunning picture of a young polar bear sleeping on an iceberg, captured by the British amateur photographer Nima Sarakani, was the people's choice among an absolute roll call of fabulous pictures. Well, let's go live now to the Natural History Museum's Pauline Roberts, who is the head of the Wildlife Photographer of the Year programme. Pauline, welcome. What a great job you've got. I mean, this is an absolutely stunning image, isn't it, this polar bear one? Well, Pauline Robert, you're absolutely right about exquisite moments and exquisite photographs. You gave our poor director a bit of a heart attack by quoting and referencing your particular favourite. He's literally going through all of his list looking for it. I don't think he actually quite got there, but thank you so much for joining us and taking us through all those wonderful photographs. I'm back with headlines here on the programme in a moment or two. Live from London, this is BBC News. At least 27 people are killed as two explosions hit Pakistan's Baluchistan province on the eve of the general election. The crisis in dentistry in England as people queue for NHS appointments and the government sets out a new plan. The US Secretary of State meets with Israeli and Palestinian leaders in the latest push for a ceasefire and hostage deal.
On Verify today, we've been looking at the government's claims that poor weather conditions had no impact on a fall in small boat crossings in the Channel.
And 3 students have deciphered a 2,000-year-old scroll using AI, unlocking mysteries of what the Romans spent their time thinking about. Hello and welcome to today's Verified Live. 2 bombs have exploded in southwest Pakistan just hours before polls open for the general election tomorrow. At least 27 people have been killed and many more have been injured. The authorities say they were targeting the election offices in 2 parts of Baluchistan. The people of Pakistan will head to the polls after a campaign marred by violence and claims of poll rigging. Well, these, as you see on the screen, are pictures coming in so far. They're from the blast in the Pishin district outside the election office of an independent local candidate. Officials told the BBC he was meeting his polling agent at the time. Around the world and across the UK, you're watching BBC News. Well, let's take a look at another couple of stories making the headlines here in the UK, because the convicted sex offender and former singer Gary Glitter will stay in prison after losing a parole board hearing. He was jailed for 16 years in 2015 for sexually abusing 3 schoolgirls between 1975 and 1980. The 79-year-old was automatically released in February last year, but was put back behind bars 6 weeks later after breaching his licence. All proceedings at the Old Bailey in London have been delayed after a fire near the building. Around 1,500 people were told to evacuate, and around 25 firefighters have been tackling the blaze. There are no reports of any injuries. And Rishi Sunak is facing calls to apologise for a jibe about Sir Keir Starmer's position on trans people at Prime Minister's Questions. The PM ridiculed the Labour leader for U-turning on the definition of a woman. It came just moments after the Labour leader had told MPs that the mother of the murdered teenager Brianna Ghey, who was transgender, would be watching PMQs from the public gallery. More on that story a little later. You're live with BBC News. Now, the Prince of Wales has returned to public engagements for the first time since King Charles's cancer diagnosis. Prince William had stepped back after his wife, the Princess of Wales, underwent surgery. A few hours ago, he oversaw an investiture ceremony at Windsor Castle. The King spent the night at Sandringham after beginning his treatment on Monday. Here's Helena Wilkinson. Well, Azadeh Mashiri, thanks very much for the latest after that police briefing there at New Scotland Yard. Of course, there is so much background information. If you want more on this story, just follow the BBC Live page on the BBC News website or the BBC News app. As Azadeh was saying, of course, that investigation going on now for a week. So a lot of the background information, what the police have said, and of course the sightings they have been able to establish through all the work that they are currently doing with CCTV. They have 100 officers currently just scouring CCTV right across the capital. So that, the latest coming to us from the Metropolitan Police. I'll have headlines and there's business news coming up on the programme in a moment. Welcome to BBC News. Let's turn to our main headlines this half hour. At least 27 people have been killed as 2 explosions hit Pakistan's Baluchistan province on the eve of the general election there.
Of all the weeks to say that, when Brianna's mother is in this chamber, shame, parading as a man of integrity when he's got absolutely no responsibility.
We'll look at what prompted the Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer to say that to Rishi Sunak. We'll bring you the latest from Prime Minister's Questions. And we have a special BBC report with teams trying to tackle America's growing synthetic opioid crisis. First, though, it is time to round up all the business news of the day. Tiger's here, and Tiger, good afternoon.
Matthew, hello to you. Well, we're going to be talking about Uber first of all, because it has reported a record number of monthly active users in its latest results. That means that 150 million people now use the transport app, most famous for its ride-hailing services, on a regular basis. Now, there was a drop in custom during the pandemic, but Uber's reported a bounce back in demand for transport last year as people got out more and employers began to require their staff to spend more time in the office. And that's your business update around the world and across the UK. This is BBC News.
BBC News, bringing you different stories from across the UK. For more stories from across the UK, head to the BBC News website.
BBC News. Let's turn to an extraordinary special report, because fentanyl is 50 times stronger than heroin and is responsible for tens of thousands of overdose deaths in the US last year. Well, police in the US have told the BBC the public health crisis is comparable to a modern-day crack epidemic. Well, Will Grant sent this special report and a warning it does contain some distressing images. Nick Eardley at BBC Verify. Just time to show you the winning images in this year's Wildlife Photographer of the Year competition, which have been made public. This stunning picture of a young polar bear sleeping on an iceberg, captured by the British photographer Nima Sarakani, was the people's choice among a roll call of fabulous pictures. Have a look at this Balkan pond turtle that was walking in shallow waters when a dragonfly landed on its nose. And finally, the suburbs of Rome. Suddenly this flock of birds are swirling into the shape of a giant bird. Fabulous, fabulous images. Well, you're watching BBC News. Let's turn to Prime Minister's question times and the row that's emerged earlier in the day, because Rishi Sunak was criticised after attempting to mock Sir Keir Starmer's stance on defining a woman. The Commons had earlier heard that the mother of the murdered transgender teenager Brianna J was expected in the public gallery today. Our political correspondent Leila Nathu is at Westminster for us. Well, Mr. Chancellor talking to Chris Mason. Do stay with us, because we have a really busy 5 o'clock hour coming up. We'll have much more on that particular story. That is a row that's erupted and grown since PMQs a little earlier in the day. We'll have plenty more from Gaza. Let me show you the live pictures just on the border between Israel and Gaza. Anthony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, in the region again as he pushes and tries to make progress towards a new ceasefire and hostage deal. Let me tell you that we are expecting a news conference from Benjamin Netanyahu at about 5:30, no exact time, but that's when we expect it. So about 35 minutes time, we will carry that live, his reaction to what he has heard from the US Secretary of State. We'll also get the latest on that big story here in England. These are the pictures of the last few days. People queuing round the block in Bristol to try and register for an NHS dentist. Well, the government has come up with their big plan on dentistry a little earlier in the day. So we'll have reaction. We'll hear from all political sides on that story. We'll also talk to the British Dental Association. We also will have more from the Wildlife Photographer of the Year competition that is coming up. And of course, this story that is currently on the BBC News website, that hunt for the Clapham attacker, the man who used corrosive substance when he attacked a woman and 2 children. That hunt going on now for a week. We have the latest from New Scotland Yard. I was mentioning the Wildlife Photographer of the Year. We have some wonderful pictures to actually show you, and we will actually talk to the organisers of that competition. So all of that is coming up, as I say, in the next little while. First, though, we're going to catch up with weather details, and that's with Thomas.
Hello. Well, yes, there is some snow in the forecast, but it's not going to be particularly widespread. That's it from me. Bye-bye.
Live from London, this is BBC News. At least 27 people are killed as 2 explosions hit Pakistan's Baluchistan province on the eve of the general election. We'll be speaking live to a Pakistan expert. The crisis in dentistry in England as people queue round the block for NHS appointments, and the government sets out their new plan. We'll speak to the chair of the British Dental Association. The US Secretary of State meets with Israeli and Palestinian leaders. We'll bring you the latest updates on the push for a ceasefire and a hostage deal. Israel's Prime Minister speaks this hour.
Of all the weeks to say that, when Brianna's mother is in this chamber, shame, parading as a man of integrity when he's got absolutely no responsibility.
What prompted the Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer to say that to Rishi Sunak? We'll bring you the latest from today's Prime Minister's questions. And we look at some of the beautiful images from the Wildlife Photographer of the Year competition and hear from the organisers. Hello and welcome to today's Verified Live. 2 bombs have exploded in southwest Pakistan just hours before the polls open for the general election tomorrow. At least 27 people have been killed and many more injured. The authorities say they were targeting the election offices in 2 parts of Baluchistan. The people of Pakistan will head to the polls after a campaign marred by violence and claims of poll rigging. We'll be live in the Middle East in just a moment, but around the world and across the UK, you're watching BBC News. Let's turn first to a couple of other stories making the headlines here in the UK, because the convicted sex offender and former singer Gary Glitter will stay in prison after losing a parole board hearing. He was jailed for 16 years in 2015 for sexually abusing 3 schoolgirls between 1975 and 1980. The 79-year-old was automatically released in February last year, but was put back behind bars 6 weeks later after breaching his licence. All proceedings at the Old Bailey in London have been delayed after a fire near the building. Around 1,500 people were told to evacuate, and around 25 firefighters have been tackling the blaze. There are no reports of any injuries. And one person has been left with minor injuries after a passenger train struck a large tree on the track and then derailed. The East Midlands service partly came off the rails between Thetford and Harling Road in Norfolk on Tuesday evening on its way to Norwich. An engineer at the scene said everyone on board had had a very lucky escape. Well, you're live with BBC News. Now, as promised, let's turn to the Middle East, because the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has been having talks with the Israeli and Palestinian officials to try to negotiate a ceasefire in Gaza. Hamas says it has given its response to a framework proposal. Israel and the United States are said to be reviewing that. Well, the Gaza Health Ministry announced earlier that a further 123 people have been killed in the last 24 hours, taking the overall total to nearly 28,000. It's 4 months now since the attacks on Israel by Hamas, in which 1,200 people were killed and more than 250 were taken hostage.
So, Minister's making the point there that there are legitimate questions for the Labour leader to answer. It'll be interesting to see how long that line holds, though, with real criticism swirling around the Prime Minister now about not just being potentially a bit insensitive, but also being transphobic, which he strongly denies.
Peter, thanks very much. That brings us to the end of this particular edition. Don't forget, we have Israel's Prime Minister about to address the media in the next few minutes. We'll carry that live here on BBC News. Don't go away.
Watch now on iPlayer.
Welcome to BBC News. Let's turn to our main headlines here. The US Secretary of State has been meeting with Israeli and Palestinian leaders. Benjamin Netanyahu is due to speak to the media in the next few minutes. We will carry that live. The crisis in dentistry in England as people queue around the block for NHS appointments. The government sets out their new plan. The River Wye has turned green, say campaigners, because of chicken manure, and they're taking the government to court because of it. We also have a special BBC report with the teams trying to tackle America's growing synthetic opioid crisis. And let seeping bears lie. We look at some of the beautiful images from the Wildlife Photographer of the Year competition and hear from the organisers. Well, hopefully we'll squeeze a lot of that in before that Netanyahu press conference. Now, though, let's head to the BBC Sports Centre, round up the sport of the day, and that's with Jane Dougal. Jane, good evening.
Hello there, Matthew. Well, we start with build-up to...
בערב שבת, ה-1 בדצמבר,
On the night of Saturday, December 1st, the fighter Amir Butson wrote these words.
Well, there we go into the last question. Let me just summarise what we've heard in this news conference, because Benjamin Netanyahu is saying that victory is within reach. It's a matter of months, he said. He several times referenced the Hamas response to talk of a ceasefire and hostage deal, and he twice described it as the crazy demands of Hamas. He said agreeing to them would invite another massacre. He went on to talk about the hostages. He said to the families, I have your loved ones on my mind permanently as that continues to have those negotiations. And he said Israel must be able to act in Gaza at any time. So those are some of the key lines from that news conference as we come to the end of today's Verified Live. Thanks so much for watching, and hopefully I'll see you at the same time tomorrow. Bye for now.
Hello. Well, is snow on the way? The answer is yes for some of us,